All right, so get this. We're diving into how the Orthodox Church sees itself. And let me tell you, it's really got me thinking about how, well, faith in the real world kind of bump up against each other.
Yeah, it's a perspective you don't always hear laid out, but it really matters when you start thinking about how different parts of Christianity deal with that whole give unto Caesar thing.
Totally. And this text, it doesn't mess around. It just comes right out and says the Orthodox Church is like two churches in one. Not different denominations or anything, but like two sides of the same coin. Ever heard that before?
It's definitely unique. They call it the secular and the consecrated. And when they say secular, we're talking clergy who are right there in the thick of it, living in the everyday world, participating in society. But then on the flip side, you've got the consecrated, those leading that more withdrawn monastic life.
So there's this whole other dimension to the church most people don't even know about. It's wild. And speaking of wild, the excerpt uses those monasteries at Mount Athos as like the ultimate example of this.
Ah, Mount Athos. Talk about a place steeped in legend, a self-governing monastic republic. I mean, how's that for separation of church and state? But what's really interesting is how the text talks about these monasteries, like the ones on Athos. It says they're like a checks and balances system on those parts of the church that are more connected to politics or just power in general, you know?
Okay, now that is what gets me thinking, because here in the U.S., the way we usually see it, church and state are pretty separate, right?
And you're right, in many ways they are. But this text makes you think about those lines of influence that aren't so obvious. Like, even if a church isn't officially tied to any government, could it still be swayed by stuff like what's popular at the time, political pressure, even just wanting to fit in, you know?
That is such a good point. Makes you wonder what's going on under the surface in other institutions, too, and not just religious ones.
Totally. This twofold thing, whether it's on purpose or not, it's like something you could apply to all sorts of stuff. Academia, research, even how the news works. Anywhere you have this balance of power, there are going to be things going on behind the scenes.
So speaking of stuff going on behind the scenes, you sent over this other source, and I got to say, it's got some strong opinions about how Protestants see Orthodox clergy. Like, they skipped a few chapters in the Understanding the Orthodox Church handbook.
Yeah, it really dives right into that. A lot of it has to do with the role of priests. Like, there's this idea out there that because Orthodox priests can get married, their authority is somehow .idk. Less
Right.
legit,
Yep.
and the text goes all in, even pulling out Bible verses to back it up.
Right, it's not pulling any punches. And then it gets into the whole history of the word priest itself. Like, who knew that was basically a linguistic oops?
I know, right? It's fascinating. And it really emphasizes this idea that for Orthodox Christians, the priesthood of all believers is like fundamental. It's not that the clergy are above everyone else. It's more that they have different roles to play within that larger priesthood.
So it's not about who has the authority, but how that authority is understood and used within the whole community, right?
Exactly. And a lot of that difference in how they see things goes all the way back to how these branches of Christianity developed after the Roman Empire fell apart. Speaking of history, that brings us to someone the text calls out by name, Emperor Constantine. He tends to get people talking, let's just say that.
That's putting it mildly. I mean, for a lot of Protestants, Constantine's conversion and Christianity becoming the official religion of Rome, that's like the turning point, and not in a good way.
Yeah, it was a huge shift, no doubt.
Yeah.
But this text, it's like, hold on a sec, let's not put all the blame on Constantine. It's saying this whole move towards a more structured church, it was more about adapting to survive than it was about, abandoning the core of what they believed.
And let's not forget, those early church leaders, they knew what persecution felt like firsthand. It's not like they just woke up one day and thought, you know what sounds fun? Power.
Exactly. The text even says that this is when the whole monastic tradition really started to take off, and it frames it as a direct response to all these changes, a way to hold on to that early spirit of devotion and, honestly, resistance, even while the rest of the church was finding its place in the world.
Okay, so if we're thinking about this twofold structure idea, are you saying that these two branches of the Orthodox Church are the one that's more out in the world, and the monastic side, that they were actually balancing each other out?
It's a really interesting argument. It's like having this built-in safeguard against going too far in either direction,
Yeah.
But it does make you wonder, how often does that kind of thing happen in other parts of life?
That is such a good question. And it's one we're going to keep digging into as we look closer at these texts. Because let's be real, you deserve more than just the surface level. You deserve a deep dive. So we've got these two branches of the Orthodox Church, right? Each with its own kind of vibe, its own way of seeing things. But how do they actually, work together? It's not like there's a hotline from a monastery to the top, right?
Not quite. It's less like a top-down thing and more like a conversation,
Yeah.
but like a really, really old conversation where each side respects the other, but they're not afraid to call each other out either. The text talks about it as this kind of creative tension, with the monasteries being the source of spiritual authority that keeps the more worldly side of the church in check.
So it's like more of a moral compass than a rule book, huh? I like that.
Exactly. And remember, these monasteries are often way out there, far from everything, right? They're supposed to be these guardians of the faith, like the purest form of it, untouched by the messiness of politics and stuff.
Which would make their critiques even more powerful.
Yeah.
It's not about ambition or anything. It's coming from a place of real belief.
It's like that saying, the truth will set you free. But sometimes you need someone who's willing to say what's true, even when it's hard to hear. And get this, the text even gives a real-world example. Russia in the late 1800s. The official church was super tight with the czar, with the government, and a lot of people felt like the monasteries were the ones who were keeping it real. They were the ones who were more connected to what people were actually going through.
Whoa, that's really interesting. So even within the system, you can have these other centers of power and influence popping up.
Exactly. And the text makes it clear both of these branches, they need each other. The part of the church that's out in the world, it needs that grounding, that link to the heart of the faith, which is what the monasteries represent. And the monasteries, they need the other side to take those teachings, those values, and actually put them into practice,
It's like two halves of a whole, like
Yeah.
you were saying. But this twofold thing, this idea of hidden influences and different perspectives, that's got to be bigger than just one branch of Christianity, right?
Right. And that's what's so cool about it. This whole deep dive, it's not just about getting the Orthodox Church. It's about using that to look at all the stuff that shapes our lives,
Yeah.
Like what's really going on in those places that seem totally straightforward? What are the arguments and debates that are shaping things behind the scenes?
It reminds you that there's always more to the story, always something else to discover. And honestly, that's what makes all this so fascinating, right? So for everyone listening, next time you're trying to understand something big and complex like a government, a company, even a whole movement, ask yourself, what's the twofold structure here? What am I missing? That's how you really dive deep. And on that note, we'll catch you in the next one.